I see people versus the planet as people are fighting against the planet. And as you say, the planet is out of balance. But this is a war that people cannot win. Because if people do win the war, it means that they have no habitat. It means that they have no ecosystems. It means that they've converted the planet completely into, cities and pavement, and they've just run over nature.
Welcome to today's Climate Emergency Forum. Our discussion for today will be people versus planet. And what is happening? Is it the people who are fighting against the planet? Or is the planet going back on its deal and fighting against us? Well, from my perspective, it's really the people who are working against the planet. If you look at it from the perspective that we're completely out of balance. And I'm going to give you an example, which is anecdotal, but I think illustrates my point quite well. So one of my favorite shows from my childhood is the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And probably many of you are very familiar with this show. And if you are familiar with this show, you know that Mary, despite her best efforts with parties and being the hostess with the mostest, her parties tend to always flop. But one of my favorite party that flopped was her dinner party with her aunt, who was ostensibly a famous news reporter, and her boss, Lou Grant. So this party was set up with a table with 6 chairs for 6 guests. She had prepared exactly 6 portions of Veal Prince Orloff. And as she was serving the meal, she first went to Mr. Grant. And Mr. Grant was sort of a big fella and not one of the fancy types. He took 2 portions of the veal when he was simply supposed to take 1. This was a rather awkward situation because she was trying to impress her very important guests. Well, in the end, it was either Mary just not eat and look silly, or she had to, and what she did, pull Mr. Grant aside and explain to him that each guest will only receive 1 portion of the veal. Well, this set him way off because he was incredibly hungry. So he gave back 1 of the portions and was in a grouchy mood the entire time, which set everyone else off into a grouchy mood, thus making this a terrible evening for everyone. Okay, so this is just a skit, it's a comedy sketch, but why don't we put this in the context of our world? Not everyone gets to eat veal, but what if there are only enough portions for the people that we have on the planet? And I mean portions of food, and I also mean portions of water. Well, then what happens? Not everyone is polite as those at the dinner party. Some people are gonna start fighting each other in a rather extreme manner. We're already seeing this play out in the world. As we have discussed in previous episodes in the Climate Emergency Forum, only about 2.5% of the planet's water is potable. So with the population that we now have, there are already water wars breaking out. Even in states as prosperous as California, we see neighbor pitted against neighbor for water rights. Farmers who are pitted against people for water rights. And then when we look at countries and huge super states like Mexico City, which is experiencing a water shortage, we see that people cannot get along when their basic needs are met. So yes, we do have too many people on this planet. We cannot expect to have continual population growth without all-out wars breaking out all over the planet as they already are. Look at what's happening in the Northern Triangle of Latin America. People are migrating to the United States. This is a geopolitical nightmare. I suggest that whoever thinks that we can have runaway, continual population growth, and peace on earth is simply living with their head in the clouds. And I would love to hear from the other scientists here on our panel. And for that, I want to welcome Dr. Peter Carter. Now, Dr. Carter is one of our esteemed guests that we have here on the forum, and he is an IPCC expert reviewer, has written books, and is founder of the Climate Emergency Institute. So Peter, what say you on this whole population issue?
Thank you, Regina. It's, as you say, it's a huge issue. It's been one that has been debated and contentious for many, many, many years. Listening to you, I was reminded, of course, of the famous quote by Gandhi: "There's enough food and everything else in the world for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed." So with respect to global climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, it's very much and has become well known as a so-called climate justice issue. I was also reminded, listening to your introduction, that our really great United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his last formal speech at a big meeting, which was only last month, he started by saying that we have to stop the war against nature. And he actually made a speech a year ago in which he said the same thing. And I think that's right on. It's very clear that there is a war going on, and on and on and on, which is literally killing nature. And the very best and most glorious parts of nature are unquestionably being killed, not only by our greenhouse gas pollution, but by other pollutions, and also by direct destructive impacts. So two wonderful gems which are being destroyed, are being killed, are of course for the oceans, the Great Barrier Reef, and for the land, of course, the Amazon rainforest. So why is this happening? Why does it appear that we're doing this? I have trouble really with, I've had trouble for years with my best environmental friends who say, well, you know, it's sort of human nature. Humanity is doing this, you know, so we've got a real problem with humanity, or the human race is doing this, or it's our species. We're hardwired to be nasty and destructive. But, you know, looking over the history of our species, that's not actually, I don't see that as quite fair. We've been around for, and I've said this before, we've been around for a couple of 100,000 years. And there's no question that the direct accelerating destruction of our wonderful planet, that's been going on only for a little bit more than a couple of 100 years. So the problem really is industrial civilization. And I think the problem with industrial civilization is conflict, as Regina mentioned, and more than conflict, it's war. So I see that as the big problem, what I call the Euro-American culture, which has been, of course, for hundreds of years. It's a culture of conquest. We in this culture, and I'm certainly part of that, our big thing is conquest. You know, we want to conquest the moon, conquest Mars, conquest the oceans, conquest. You know, when I was a boy, the highest mountain, Everest, was conquered. You know, by a British climber, and so here we are conquering everything, and we conquer other people as well. And Antonio Guterres is quite right. We are pale-skinned, called white culture. You know, I see that we're doing this, and I feel very much a part of that responsibility. and we seem to be completely different, for example, from the indigenous people, right? The indigenous people, the record shows they don't do this. You know, when the first Europeans arrived in North America, they were absolutely amazed at the abundance of everything, abundance of game, deer, birds on the ocean, fish. You know, they recorded that that part of the planet was just absolutely full and brimming with life. Well, it didn't take us very long with our idea of conquest and also our idea of economics. It didn't take us very long to start destroying all of that wonderful, wonderful life and oppressing and exploiting the indigenous people that we found there. And we didn't even notice that they were, you know, behaving in a different way from us. We didn't even notice that. We paid no attention to the fact that they weren't wiping out, you know, the species that they lived with. We just went ahead and started our thing of conquest and exploitation. So we have a highly exploitive economy. It's a thoroughly bad economy in my view. It's irrational, it's insane, and it's worse than that. So uh, that's how I see it. I think it's a very difficult thing to talk about, but it's the most important thing to talk about because there's no question we are wiping everything out of the face of our wonderful, wonderful Earth, our only home.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. There's a lot that you brought in there, and I do want to push back. And I feel as though, in a way, you proved my point that the less people there are, the more abundance there is, and the reason the people who came, the Europeans who came to America, saw great abundance of wildlife, of fish in the rivers, was because there were so few people, not so much of the purity of the native peoples, which I think sometimes gets overplayed. And as a matter of fact, there was a great deal of warring between tribes, and that's something that we can discuss to a greater degree at a later date. But at this point in time, I would like to hear very much what Paul has to say, who is a climate scientist and who has worked and taught at the University of Ottawa and the Laboratory for Paleoclimatology. So, Paul, what are your thoughts on the matter?
Yes, thank you, Regina, and thank you, Peter. So I'll elaborate on some of the points that you've both been making. So definitely, you know, I see people versus the planet as people are fighting against the planet. And as you say, the planet is out of balance. But this is a war that people cannot win, because if people do win the war, it means that they have no habitat. It means that they have no ecosystems. It means that they've converted the planet completely into, you know, cities and pavement, and they've just run over nature. And of course, we rely on many, many resources from nature to survive, you know, not just food and water, which are the most obvious ones, but, you know, also, you know, the clean air and, you know, sufficient food supplies and water supply, but clean air and a stable climate. You know, if we have a completely unstable climate with extreme weather events skyrocketing, then, you know, we go from droughts, from torrential rainfall and flooding to extreme dryness and droughts, and then back and forth between these two things. And, you know, in winter times, it will get below zero, and then we have warming spells for 3 or 4 days or a week, and then it goes above zero, and then it refreezes and above zero. And those crossing points through zero, which we get in northern climates a lot more often than we used to, are wreaking havoc on infrastructure, you know, not just roads and rail, but cities. And, you know, it's also extremely difficult for farmers to do any planning, to know when to plant, to know when to harvest, etc. So people versus planet is a war that people cannot win. It's like shooting, it's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're undercutting our life support systems on the planet. And this is, of course, a big tragedy of the commons. And it's, you know, as we move forward with more and more scarcity of resources, it leads to more and more human conflict. So then it becomes people versus people on a planet that cannot sustain the levels of people and that we've become used to. Our entire economic systems are predicated and based on growth, constant growth, right? Things always always getting larger, always building, always doing more. And the problem is this growth is always at the expense of the environment. People, I don't know, there's some built-in or innate fear of the wild, so to speak. You know, when we evolved as a species, we used to travel in bands of 100 or 200 people, you know, nomads, roving bands. We'd build, you know, whether we lived in caves or built shelters, we'd put stockades up and fortifications to keep the other out. And, you know, at night, you know, with no artificial lighting, when it got dark, we were scared of the sounds coming from nature and, you know, worried about our protection and health. And people still have this sort of thought in their mind that nature is in opposition to us. And we need to change the whole paradigm, the whole way of thinking, to work with nature to help and to just give it help it, you know, not destroy it, so that it can continue to sustain us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. And you said quite a lot. The more people we have, the more greenhouse gases, the greater the warming. And in fact, on the day that we're recording, I'm here in New York City. It's towards the end of March, and it's going to be 80 degrees. Now, anyone who's lived an amount of time, even if one's only 30 or 40, you'd know that 20 years ago, 80 degrees in New York City is absurd. 80 degrees in April would be absurd. The planet is rapidly warming. So the idea that we can continue to have more and more people and things will somehow be okay, again, I don't think that this is a realistic concept. And Peter, you had quoted Gandhi, that there's enough for people's needs, but not enough for people's greeds. But I would like for you to elaborate on that, because we have spoken on food scarcity in the past. And I know that you're so very well versed in this area. And you've even said that with the warming of the planet, it makes planting and growing crops more difficult, because with the level of heat in the soil, I mean, the seeds are just not going to grow. And of course, with sea level rise, we're getting less and less land. So Peter, could you please let me know how you would resolve these two colliding forces?
Oh, that I could, you know, oh, that I could have a magic wand to become emperor of the world. But the answer is that we have to unify, right? Our nations, our cultures, what we think of different races have to unify. There is only one race, that's the human race. And you're right. When our lot came into what they call the New World, first in South America and then in North America, yeah, the people were, the population was relatively scattered, if you like. Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, we encountered very small tribes. And I could go into a very quick version of a story, which is a record of one of the early settlers in Canada who was sort of exploring for the Hudson Bay Company. And it's a story about British Columbia, and I read it in his diary. And of course, the explorers, the discoverers who became the conquerors, had to be helped by the indigenous people. So this group of European people were traveling north up British Columbia, And everywhere they went, they found this little settled tribe. The tribe would say, "Oh, come join us." You know, they didn't speak the language, but it was clear. They were greeted, in every case in this record, they were greeted with, "Here's some food, you know, have a rest, you know, spend some time." And then they would spend a few days, and then they would say, to indicate, "Well, we have to get off again, right? You give us a guide and we'll go north." Well, the funny thing was that every tribe that they went to, the chief said the same thing. "What on earth would you want to leave? Stay here with us. We have everything. You know, this is wonderful. Life is great." So there's clearly a difference between, a huge difference between those people who are indigenous, who have never moved around very much, and those people like us who have moved all over the world. So there's a different attitude, and we could boil it down to economics. I think we're all pretty well agreed on that, right? The indigenous people are reaching out to us. They're reaching out to us, certainly in British Columbia and in Canada and in the world. And one of the big things clearly we have to do is we have to learn from their traditional ways, I believe, and that is working with nature and not working against nature. The best book that I've read on this, and I would recommend this book to anyone that wants to understand what seems to be incomprehensible, is a book written in the 1980s by Professor Carolyn Merchant of University of Berkeley. She's retired, of course. She was a environmental history professor, and she wrote the book, The Death of Nature, which is quite a term. And what I want to say is that she explains in depth really what happened in Europe, what happened in North America. It's not quite what we sort of think happened. It's somewhat different. She brings in the aspects of religion and Christianity, etc. Unification, making peace, working for what the Franciscans call deep peace, peace within ourselves, peace with our family, peace in our community, and peace amongst nations. I have a big problem with nation states. I think the nation state has to disappear, frankly. We have to have this huge transformation, massive revolution, in which we are not only working with nature, but we're replenishing nature. And a lot of people are talking about that, which is great. Yeah, big, big, big change. And we have to change, and we have to do it now. My hero for that is Krishnamurti, who was a Indian sort of guru and got very famous in the West. And he said to us, "Well, you all have to change. You have to change now, and you have to change totally." Big challenge. I think he's right. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. Definitely the native peoples lived in much more in harmony with nature than we do today. As Paul said, this industrialized society in which we all live puts so much stress upon the planet. I still contend, however, that part of the reason why the native peoples were so, in tune with nature and able to live in concord with her rather than against her, the population was much smaller than we are now. And I just don't see us going back to those days. But I'm really not sure what the answer is. But I do think we start from where we are now, which unfortunately is not a great place to begin. Paul, what do you think?
Yes, this there's so much competition now for resources. Years ago, of course, populations, as you say, were much, much smaller. So the resources of the earth seemed kind of unlimited. When people ran out of food in a certain area, they would migrate to other areas. They would often spend their lifetimes with very little interaction with people outside of their band of 100 or 200 people. And they grew, a lot of people at that time had this kind of fear of the unknown. And when they would run into other people, they would see them as a threat, and there would be, warring between them. But things like that were on a much smaller scale. They were much more regional or local. They didn't extend worldwide. So the impact of people on the planet, when you think about it, it's the consumption per capita. So take different countries, the average consumption per capita, and if you multiply that by the population of that country, so the total capita, total number of people in that country, and also by the technology level, because one person driving a massive bulldozer in Canada's oil sands / tar sands, can do a tremendous amount of environmental damage, at the particular region where they're extracting the oil from the bitumen. And we also have to keep in context the sort of time scales that are involved here. Like the Great Barrier Reef and the Amazon rainforest, Peter mentioned as being under great stress, both in the oceans and on land. And there's also, of course, the massive loss of Arctic sea ice and snow cover, and tremendous changes in the Arctic as we go from a cold environment in the Arctic region to a warm environment. This is a very rapid, abrupt transition. But we have to sort of think, well, how long has the Amazon rainforest been there? And it goes back to about the Eocene, warm period on the Earth. Of course, there were drier periods in some of the ice ages. There was drier periods, a bit less rain in the Amazon, maybe a little shrinking of it, but it's basically been there 55 million years. And here we are, with quite possibly within a few decades, completely, tipping the Amazon over, losing the trees to, during droughts, and having them burn, and having no forests grow back where the forests are now. So the rainforest could be converted to savanna, basically grasslands. The Great Barrier Reef and other coral reefs, they've been around on the planet for tens of millions of years. And we're seeing massive die-offs. Some years we see a third or even a half of regions of the barrier reef just bleaching out and dying within a few seasons, and a few seasons in a row of the bleaching, and they basically can't recover. And the Great Barrier Reef is really the rainforest of the ocean. So we're hitting all of these limits. We assume there's no boundaries on the Earth, that things are infinite, but what we're doing now is we're running into like what game theorists would call a zero-sum game, where the resources are so limited and so finite that if somebody grabs more than their share of the resources, then it's at the deficit of other people, and there's just not enough to go around. So it creates a lot of global conflict.
Wow, Paul, those numbers you were throwing around regarding the Amazon, unbelievable, unbelievable. How many years it took to build this beautiful region and how quickly we're destroying it. But I have to say, this has been a lively and interesting conversation. It sounds like Paul and I sort of see eye to eye, and Peter is the lone optimist. And I have to say, the optimist's voice in this discussion needs to be the loudest. It needs to be the loudest because we need hope. We need optimism. We need to believe. We need belief. So thank you so much, Peter, for that. It's truly appreciated. And for all of those who have continued to watch today's Climate Emergency Forum, we thank you for once again joining us. If you've liked today's show, please hit that like button as well as subscribe. It helps us with YouTube's algorithms and gets our information out to more people. So thank you once again for tuning in for today's Climate Emergency Forum.